Cold War and the idea of freedom. Lecture terms. The idea of freedom. Focus question. How did the Cold War reshape ideas of American freedom? Freedom versus totalitarianism. The Cold War was an ideological conflict in which both sides sought to win support across the world. Freedom was central to mobilizing public opinion, and in the 1950s, it was a prominent theme in academia, the media, and mass culture, as well as the government in the United States. The Cold War set the boundaries for understanding, quote, freedom in the 20th century. Culture and history were mobilized for the Cold War. Historians argue that the American creed of pluralism, tolerance, and equality had always defined American life, and neglected the ways in which race and ethnicity had restricted freedom in the United States. The federal government pressed Hollywood to make anti-communist films from which all references to racism were to be removed. The CIA and the Defense Department patronized the arts, enlisting actors, dancers, and musicians to promote the superiority of American values at home and abroad. The government, the Defense Department, also sponsored magazines and academic conferences. The CIA even funded the controversial abstract expressionist art of painter Jackson Pollock, whose canvases, created by dropping and splashing paint, were said to embody cultural freedoms absent in socialist nations. The Cold War's other master concept was totalitarianism. This word was first used in World War II to describe fascist Italy and Germany as aggressive, ideological governments that harshly controlled all of civil society and denied the rights and alternative values that might lead to social change. Totalitarianism, now in the Cold War, soon came to describe the Soviet Union and its allies. This concept helped spread the belief that powerful governments were the greatest threat to freedom. Whatever the Soviet Union supported was automatically deemed antithetical to freedom. The American Medical Association launched the largest public relations campaign in history against Truman's proposal for national health insurance, calling it, quote, socialized medicine. Soviet hostility to organized religion automatically made Christian worship a bastion of freedom in the United States as well. Human rights. The Cold War also shaped the idea of human rights. World War II's atrocities and the Four Freedoms and the Atlantic Charter sparked calls for a new global order ruled by universal rights for all of humanity. The war crimes trials of German officials, the Nuremberg trials, showed that the international community would hold individuals accountable for violations of human rights and for crimes against humanity. In 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. This declared that all people should have basic rights to freedom of speech and religion, should be free from arbitrary government, and should enjoy social and economic entitlements such as housing, education, health care, and an adequate standard of living. Though the document could not be enforced anywhere, its assertion that governments were accountable for the way they treated their citizens became widely accepted. Debates over the UDHR showed the contradictions and tensions in the idea of human rights. The degree to which human rights should supersede national sovereignty and who or what should protect the human rights that governments violate, are still unsettled questions today. Both the United States and the Soviet Union resisted the creation of a mechanism to enforce the UDHR because both feared outside interference in domestic and foreign policy. American leaders were particularly sensitive about race relations, which they feared might invite UN action against the United States. In the 1950s, Cold War considerations limited human rights, and both America and the Soviet Union used human rights for their own interests. The USSR claimed to provide its citizens with social and economic rights, while the United States criticized the Soviets for violating democratic rights and civil liberties. Only in 1992 did Congress ratify the part of the UDHR that covers, quote, civil and political rights. It has not yet ratified the Declaration's, quote, economic, social, and cultural rights. The Truman presidency focus question. What were the major initiatives of Truman's domestic policies? Truman's Fair Deal. After the war, President Truman faced the monumental task of shifting America from war to peace. The more than 12 million men still in the military in 1945 wanted to return to their families and jobs, and demobilization occurred rapidly. While some veterans found civilian life difficult, others used GI Bill benefits to build or buy homes, start small businesses, and go to college. Most veterans went into the labor force, taking jobs from more than 2 million women workers. The government dismantled wartime agencies that regulated industry and labor and set price controls. The dismantling of these agencies sparked immediate inflation in the United States. Backed by Democratic liberals and unions, Truman, in 1945, tried to revive New Deal politics with a program he eventually called the Fair Deal. This would improve the social safety net and raise living standards. Truman pressed Congress to hike the minimum wage, to create a national health insurance system, and to increase public housing, Social Security, and educational aid. Post-war civil tensions. The year 1946 was one of labor revolt. The AFL and the CIO launched Operation Dixie to bring unions to the South and end the anti-labor conservatism of Southern politics. They did this by sending hundreds of labor organizers into the region's textile mills, steel factories, and fields. With no more overtime work for war production and skyrocketing inflation caused by the end of price controls, workers' real income dropped sharply. Workers, 5 million of them, responded by going on strike to demand wage raises. 750,000 steelworkers conducted the single largest strike in U.S. history up to that point. The strike wave alarmed President Truman, who became hostile to the unions and won an injunction to force striking coal miners back to work. In the 1946 elections, middle-class voters, scared by labor unrest, voted Republican, and many workers, angry at Truman's policies, stayed home. The Democrats lost both houses of Congress to the Republicans for the first time since 1920. Operation Dixie capitulated to the opposition of Southern employers and white workers' racism, ultimately keeping intact Southern political power in Washington. The 1946 elections for the House and the Senate secured the continuing domination of the Congress by a coalition of conservative Republicans and Southern Democrats. Post-war civil rights. President Truman, in his first term, embraced civil rights for African Americans, departing from the Roosevelt administration's relative lack of concern. The war against Nazism and its racial theories had raised black militancy and consciousness about the plight of black Americans. Many states established commissions on fair employment practices, and cities passed laws to end discrimination in jobs and public accommodations. A civil rights coalition of labor, religious, and black groups supported all of these efforts. By 1952, the NAACP had raised the number of black voters in the South to 20%, and in that year, no lynchings took place, as many law enforcement agencies started to crack down on the practice. Sports started to desegregate after the Brooklyn Dodgers added Jackie Robinson to their team in 1947. Also in 1947, a Commission on Civil Rights appointed by Truman issued a report called To Secure These Rights. This report called on the federal government to end segregation and guarantee equal treatment in housing, employment, education, and criminal justice. The Truman administration, calling this report an American Charter of Human Freedom, hoped to deflect Cold War criticisms that American racial relations violated democratic ideals and human rights. Truman soon presented to Congress a comprehensive civil rights program, asking for a federal civil rights commission, anti-lynching and anti-poll tax laws, and laws for equal access in jobs and education. But Congress rejected this. In the summer of 1948, however, Truman desegregated the military, which became the first large integrated institution in American history. Truman went on to help construct the most progressive Democratic platform in history for the 1948 elections, which included a robust civil rights plank. Party revolts, the 1948 election. When liberals at the 1948 Democratic Convention passed the civil rights plank for the party, many Southern delegates walked out. These so-called Dixiecrats soon formed the states' rights Democratic Party, and they nominated for president Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina. This party's platform called for, quote, complete segregation of the races, and though he denied being racist, Thurmond argued that the freedom of states to govern themselves was imperiled by the Democratic Party's civil rights plank. Truman also faced a second political insurgency from the left. The left-wing critics of Truman's foreign policy formed the Progressive Party that nominated Henry A. Wallace for president, a new progressive party. Wallace proposed expanding the welfare state and denounced segregation more vigorously than Truman ever had. Wallace differed most strongly from the Truman doctrine over the Cold War. He called for international controls on nuclear weapons and advocated trade with the Soviet Union. Yet, when Wallace welcomed the support of socialists and communists, opening the party to communist influence, many left-wing liberals abandoned his candidacy. Though Wallace threatened Truman on the left and Thurmond threatened him on the Democratic South, Truman's primary challenger was the uncharismatic Republican candidate, Thomas A. Dewey. Truman campaigned furiously, criticized the Congress for its inaction, and recycled New Deal critiques of Wall Street and warnings that Republicans wanted to end Social Security. This election was the last before television transformed electoral politics by minimizing in-depth debate and presentations of ideology and policy. Despite a widely predicted Dewey victory, Truman won an overwhelming majority in the Electoral College. For the first time since 1868, blacks decisively influenced the outcome of the election. Thurmond carried 4 southern states, anticipating a later shift of these Democratic states' voters to the Republican Party. Wallace received fewer votes than Thurmond, an outcome that made criticism of America's Cold War foreign policy even less acceptable. The Anti-Communist Crusade. Focus question. What effects did the anti-communism of the Cold War have on American politics and culture? Loyalty and disloyalty. The Cold War completely transformed American life. Society was permanently militarized. The military-industrial complex forged by World War II persisted and expanded. The United States retained a large and active federal government, which spent billions of dollars on weapons and overseas bases. National security justified enormous government projects and expenditures. These included aid to higher education and the building of a national highway system. It also made government officials secret and dishonest, leading, for example, to the covering up of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons tests conducted on U.S. soldiers and civilians. Cold War spending fostered economic growth, however, as well as scientific and technological innovations that greatly shaped civilian life in medicine, computers, aircraft, and other products. Government research needs expanded higher education. The Cold War changed immigration policy to favor refugees coming from communist countries, escaping that communism. And increased pressure was put on American officials to minimize segregation. And the Cold War, like World War I, created a culture that sharply differentiated the loyal from the disloyal and ultimately eroded civil liberties once again. In 1947, Truman created a loyalty review system in which federal employees had to prove their devotion to America without knowing who was accusing them of disloyalty and on what basis. No espionage was revealed, but hundreds lost their jobs or resigned rather than be investigated. It's ironic that in the Cold War, the United States was promoting the securing of freedom, yet simultaneously was taking regular civil freedoms away from its own citizens. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, held hearings about communist influence in Hollywood. Celebrities and famous writers and directors were forced to appear before the committee or face punishment. Though some, like Ronald Reagan, alleged that the entertainment industry was rife with communists, others refused to testify, claiming that HUAC violated constitutional protections for free speech and freedom of political association. A group called the Hollywood 10 went to jail for contempt of Congress, and Hollywood blacklisted them and hundreds of others who were accused of communist sympathies or who refused to identify alleged communists. The spy trials. Several high-profile legal cases exacerbated the anti-communist craze in the United States. Whittaker Chambers, a Time magazine editor, charged that in the 1930s, Alger Hiss, a State Department official, had given him secret documents to take to Soviet agents. Hiss denied the allegations, but was convicted of perjury and served 5 years in prison. The Truman administration put Communist Party leaders on trial for advocating revolution, and several were imprisoned. In 1951, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, working-class Jewish communists from New York, were convicted of conspiring to pass secrets about the atomic bomb to the Soviets during World War II. The evidence against them was deemed too secret to be revealed at the time, but later it became clear that Julius had not given, quote, the secret of the bomb to the Soviets, and that almost no evidence supported charges against Ethel at all. Even though their charges were less serious than spying or treason, the judge said they helped, quote, cause the Korean War. They were sentenced to death and executed in 1953. Whether or not Hiss or the Rosenbergs were actually guilty, their trials strengthened Americans' sense that a massive spy network in the United States endangered the nation as a whole. McCarthys Crusade. This climate of fear allowed an obscure Wisconsin senator to lead a spurious anti-communist crusade. In 1950, Senator Joseph R. McCarthy delivered a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, in which he claimed to have a list of 205 communists employed at the United States State Department. The charge was baseless. He constantly changed the numbers, and he never identified anyone who was actually disloyal. But McCarthy used his senatorial position to hold hearings and allege disloyalty also at the Defense Department and other government agencies. Though many Republicans embraced McCarthy's campaign as a way to damage the Truman administration, his attacks on government officials after Republican candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president in 1952 alienated the Republicans. In 1954, his allegations of disloyalty in the Army led to televised hearings that exposed McCarthy's tactics and led to his downfall. The Senate, with its Republican majority, condemned his action, and though McCarthy died 3 years later, quote, McCarthyism continued to be used to refer to the abuse of power in the name of anti-communism. Although anti-communism most affected the national government, it pervaded local government and life as well. States created committees based on HUAC to ferret out alleged communists, and state and local authorities required loyalty oaths of teachers, pharmacists, and other professionals. Private groups like the American Legion and the National Association of Manufacturers also targeted individuals for their political beliefs. Organizations that had been influenced by communists in the 1930s and 1940s became tainted, and those who would not testify about their past and present political opinions or who refused to name communists often lost their jobs. Quote, un-American books, like stories of Robin Hood, were removed from local libraries. Universities refused to host left-wing speakers and fired teachers who would not take loyalty oaths. The courts did nothing to halt these violations of civil liberties throughout the United States, and the Supreme Court defended the imprisonment of communists for their beliefs. Uses of anti-communism. Though Soviet spies certainly were in the United States, The minuscule Communist Party in the U.S. did not endanger American security. Most of those jailed or fired in the McCarthy era were guilty only of holding unpopular beliefs and engaging in unlawful political activity. Anti-communism was a popular mass movement that had its uses. One basis was in ethnic groups with roots in Eastern European countries dominated by the Soviets, like the Polish, and among American Catholics who opposed communist hostility to religion. Government agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by J. Edgar Hoover, used anti-communism to increase their own power. Anti-communism was also used for purely partisan political purposes. McCarthy and other anti-communist leaders seemed to criticize the legacy of Roosevelt and the New Deal more than they did Stalin and communism. Many Democrats embraced anti-communism to deflect Republican allegations of perhaps their own communist sympathies. The Democrats excluded many on the left and the Popular Front who had helped organize support for New Deal policies. Anti-communism made conformity the new definition of loyalty. Any criticism of the status quo now appeared subversive. Business used anti-communism against unions. White supremacists used anti-communism against black civil rights. And others used anti-communism to defend sexual morality and traditional gender roles against feminism and homosexuality. Anti-communist politics. Anti-communism, most pervasive from the late 1940s to the early 1960s, powerfully shaped American politics and culture. Republicans invoked communism to stymie Truman's political program. Truman became alarmed by excesses of anti-communism, and he seemed to retreat from it in policies in government. In 1950, he vetoed a measure that required, quote, subversive groups to register with the government, denied passports to their members, and authorized the president to deport or detain them. He refused to sign this into action. But Congress overrode his veto and enacted it anyway. In 1952, a new immigration law also passed over Truman's veto, which shot down Truman's proposals for immigration reform and allowed the deportation of communists, even if they were citizens of the United States. In 1954, the federal government's Operation Wetback resulted in the military deportation of about 1 million Mexican Americans alleged to be illegal aliens. Truman only barely expanded the coverage of Social Security, and instead of extending federal social welfare, private welfare prevailed. Union workers' contracts provided them with health insurance. Wage increases that followed the cost of living were also present. Pensions and paid vacations were also guaranteed through union contracts with employers, rather than with the United States enforcing this. But only workers in the unionized heavy industries enjoyed these benefits in America. In Europe, all workers received these benefits from the government. Cold War civil rights. All political and social groups had to comply with anti-communism or be destroyed. And this severely damaged the labor and civil rights movements that had benefited from dedicated communist organizers. After the 1947 passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which withdrew bargaining rights and legal protections from unions whose leaders refused to swear that they weren't communist, the CIO expelled left-wing unions with nearly 1 million members. Unions began to support Cold War U.S. foreign policies. since left-wingers were often the most militant advocates of women's rights and civil rights. Their expulsion left unions unable to respond to the civil rights movement and an economy that shifted from manufacturing to service work. The civil rights movement changed. While major civil rights groups at first protested Truman's loyalty program and criticized anti-communists for not defining racism as, quote, un-American, nearly all black leaders and civil rights organizations were pressured into joining the anti-communist crusade. Groups like the Southern Conference on Human Welfare that had united communists and non-communists in a struggle for both racial equality and social justice disintegrated, leaving only legalistic groups like the NAACP. Black organizations adopted Cold War language to argue that segregation and racism in the United States gave credence to Soviet criticisms of America, and thus helped solidify Cold War understandings of freedom. In a climate of anti-communism and McCarthyism, criticisms of American policy, domestic or foreign, invited a harsh response. Truman's civil rights program faltered. But the booming economy of the 1950s, which produced an affluent society in America for the first time, produced a widening gap between white affluence and black poverty, and disenfranchisement that would help inspire a civil rights resurgence in the 1960s.